Thanks for having me, and I'm new faculty at UNH in the biology department, and so we're initiating a native bee research lab, and it's very timely. As arriving in New Hampshire, I learned that there was really very little basic biology on native bees here in the state, and so our lab is working very hard to figure out the bees' needs. Firstly, what is the diversity of native bee here in the state? And then looking for sustainable practices in order to promote healthy bee populations, but also sustainable agriculture. So, as I said, we have a new bee lab, and it's an exciting time to study what native bees are living here. And so I'll briefly go over what is a native bee, because commonly people don't know what that is exactly. Talking a bit about bee declines. This has been in the news quite a lot, and it affects not only honeybees, but also native bees. And then also discussing some sustainable solutions in terms of what we can do to help the bees and promote their habitats. And so normally when I tell somebody I run a bee lab or talk about bees, everyone thinks of the honeybee. And so the honeybee is in fact not a native bee. It's an introduced species from Europe. It came over a few hundred years ago and is domesticated and not normally found in North America. So this is only one species, and it is very much commercially produced, but it's not naturally occurring here. Alternatively, there's probably about 4,000 species of native bee in North America, 20,000 worldwide, and probably about 200 locally here in the state. We don't actually know how many are in the state. This is an active line of research that we're working towards documenting the diversity. So here's just some of the varieties of bees, and I'll cover the major players, but I don't have time to talk about all of them. So to start off, there's a guild of bees called the sweat bees. They've received this name because they are found actually drinking sweat of researchers in the field. A lot of insects are salt limited, so they are also very conspicuous with their metallic coloration. And so you'll see these around in your gardens and in your farms. If you look, these metallic green and blue bees are very abundant locally and are found all over North America. These bees are ground nesting, and so you'll find these little small entrance holes. These bees forage for pollen and nectar and bring it back to these nests and make their tunnels underground. So here's a schematic of their underground burrows. They dig out a tunnel and they provide the pollen and nectar in the form of a pollen ball. So unlike honeybees, most native bees, or all native bees, do not make honey, but rather take the pollen and nectar just to feed their eggs and larvae directly. And so here we see the pollen amassed here mixed with nectar, and then they lay an egg on it. And they do this throughout their nest, and we can study the nesting biology and also look at the pollen that these bees are foraging on by directly collecting the pollen balls out of their nest. Another guild of bees are the leafcutter bees. These bees are actually derive their name because they do in fact cut leaves. So you'll see sometimes on your plants these perfectly round cut holes, and so these bees take chunks of leaf to actually line their nests. The plant's providing a lot of antimicrobial and waterproofing properties for these offspring to develop. So here are some of the bees' nests. Here's an individual returning to her nest. Here's another one guarding her nest. And they live in dead broken stems, previously hollowed out burrows from beetles or other bees. And so they live in a lot of just different plant material. Here's a cross-section of a nest. You can make them live in observation nests, and you can actually track their foraging and brood productivity. Here's a female. She's lining her nest with leaves, and then as they fill it up with pollen, you can see each brood cell cap here, and each one is a pollen mass with an egg on it. And so these bees are solitary, so unlike honeybees or bumble bees, they live on their own. So one female will forage and provide all the pollen and nectar by herself and does all the work alone. Likewise, there's a group called trap nesting bees. So similar to the leafcutter bees, these are a solitary bee, and instead of cutting leaves, they use found objects and cavities, hence the name of trap nester. Interestingly, they'll live in just about anything they find, and they do have a fondness for snail shells. So they'll find an old snail shell out in out in the grass, and they'll actually occupy these shells and provide their pollen and nectar, and it's a very nice, sturdy environment that won't be taken by predators. So we can see that the females, we can track them entering and exiting these nests, as well as we can open up the nest and see that they are depositing this pollen, laying their eggs inside, and then they can block the nest entrance with found material such as rocks, dirt, and grass to keep out ants and other predators. More commonly known bee are the Carpenter bees. These come in two varieties. We have the large Carpenter bee. They're very large, sometimes about 2 inches in size. You'll see these hovering around your decks, a lot of hardwoods, man-made structures. But they also have a small cousin, the small Carpenter bee, which my lab studies in great detail. These are very tiny little bees, and they live in rose, raspberry, sumac branches. So you likely have these in your yard if you have a garden. So these bees are called Carpenter bees because they all live in wood. So they bring back the pollen and nectar again. So these bees are usually solitary, but sometimes forming small groups. So they'll forage for the pollen and nectar, bring it back, and guard their nests. These provide really great parental care. The females stay on the nest through development. And so my lab studies these bees for not only pollination ecology, but also a lot of the parental care behavior that the mothers provide. And another group of bees are the Bumble Bees. These are probably more commonly known. They're very diverse and very abundant, and mostly we know about them because they're so large. So you can easily see them on the flowers, and people take notice. They've also become very much in concern. There are one species is red listed here in North America, and I've been talking with New Hampshire Fish and Wildlife, and we're now 4 new species of bumblebee are making the threatened endangered list. And so we know very much the bumblebees are not doing well. And so they're kind of a keystone species to understand when habitats are not suitable and when pollination services are not stable. And so they're a species in concern, but also we have hope that we can do more with them and try to help them out. They're also incredibly important pollinators. Bumblebees provide a unique type of buzz pollination. So they will actually sonicate the blooms to release the pollen for tomatoes, eggplants, cranberries, and blueberries are incredibly important for the Maine blueberry industry. And so when these bees are not doing well and disappearing, this has direct, huge implications on the crop yields and productivity. And so we're very concerned, and there's a lot of effort going into trying to help the bumblebee. And these are a gregarious bee, so not quite as large in colony as the honeybee, but they do form large groups with queens and workers, and they live underground in these honey pots that they make out of plant resin and wax. So this is just a few of the native bees. There's too many to talk about. If anyone wants to know anything more about native bees, I'd be happy to tell you about them. But yeah, so there's a great diversity, and we're working very hard to figure out just simply what's here, how are they doing, and then how can we help them. So we know the bees are not doing well. Globally, locally, there's been ever-increasing reports that bees are in decline. So here's just a few of the headlines we see in the news about global pollinator declines through work in the Netherlands and the UK. As well, we see locally here in Eastern North America, great data looking at 140 years of bee decline. Many species are just simply not here that were here 50, even 10 years ago. So solving this problem is not straightforward. We know that there's a lot of factors stressing out the bees and their habitats. So there's been great changes in agricultural practices and land use. And so the introduction of pesticides and the fragmentation of landscapes are all leading to fragmentation and decline of these bees' habitats. Likewise, climate change is causing certain flowers to come out of sync with the native bee. So a bee normally would emerge in time with the bloom that it would forage on. But due to the changing climates, some of these flowers and bee life cycles are coming out of switch. So it's an ever-increasing problem. Likewise, there's a lot of alien species, both bee and plant. So with the introduction of non-native bees, this offsets some of the native bees. Likewise, the introduction of non-native plants can offset some of the wildflowers. So again, it's a complicated relationship. And more popularly known are the increasing loads of parasites and pathogens. A lot of the news on colony collapse disorder is really focusing on the varroa mite and some of the chalkbird disease and fungal pathogens they're being introduced to. And with the domestication of honeybee and the movement of honeybees around, they're really spreading a lot of these pathogens throughout a lot of farms, and there is spillover into the native bee population. And so we see that there's all these factors acting in isolation, but they're also acting in concert. So it's a big ask to figure out exactly what combination is causing the decline, but we know there's many factors. And so to understand that we need to do a more holistic approach if we want to help out these bees, that looking at any one factor in isolation will not really address the problem. But to end on a bit of a happier note, there is things we can do. And so we know there are sustainable solutions and things that local citizens, gardeners, farmers can do in their own land and in their own properties to help out the native bee. So we know that every third of bite of food that we eat comes from a native bee. And so it's important to note that these are unmanaged populations of bees. So a lot of farmers in the East and in New England are not relying on domesticated bees. They're simply relying on native bee pollination for their crops. So these are really the unsung heroes of the pollinator world. So without these bees, we simply wouldn't have most of the fruits and vegetables that we rely on. So there's growing initiatives to really protect these bees and do what we can to maintain these populations in our yards and gardens. One of the projects is this Project Share, and it's really just simply having areas reserved for the environment, leaving unmowed, undisturbed patches for bees to forage. So the constant act of mowing and paving and everything urbanization and fragmentation does reduces habitat for bees. So simply having wild meadow plots will encourage bees to thrive. Likewise, there's this bee-friendly farming initiative, and there's the website here. There's also a bee-friendly gardening initiative, and so if you go here, there's a lot of really great recommendations for best practices. Again, just planting wildflowers, not mowing, simply not disturbing the landscape. We have this habit, we want everything to be clean and pristine. We want to cut things, we want to make it look nice. But that's not necessarily the best thing for the native bee. And moreover, the pesticide use, we're learning more and more, has very negative implications on bees' memory, learning, reproduction, and survival. So these pesticides we're using and spraying are very negative in terms of bee survival and health. And so if we can in any way reduce or omit pesticide use, it will certainly give the bees a fighting chance. And like I said, planting flowers, a simple thing like having food, we take for granted. We need food to live, so do the bees. The floral availability is simply something that's being removed for most bees. Habitats, they don't have flowers available year-round, so planting native bees, native flowers, that bloom throughout the entire season will allow for them to have a variety of diet and simply have nutrition to survive and to reproduce and feed their offspring. And then there's other things we can do. Like I said, we have this habit of being so clean and pristine in our yards and gardens. We are removing all possible habitat for these bees. So at Woodman Farm at the University of New Hampshire Durham campus, we have this bee hotel. So you can actually reintroduce refuse that would simply be removed from a farm or a yard or a garden and bring it back in kind of a fun way by making a bee hotel. So these bee hotels, we also have one on display here inside at the exhibition there. If you want to check it out, it's a bit of a smaller scale. It provides habitat for these stick nesting bees and the cavity nesting bees. There's thousands of habitats here for native bee, and it's a nice, can be a kind of a nice arty thing if you get into it. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much for listening. And I couldn't possibly do this work without all of the hardworking students at UNH who are actively trying to document and help the bees here in New England. Thank you.
How how successful were you in getting residents for your bee hotel?
They're moving in, yeah. So we have some success. We erected it a bit late in the season. So it's an ongoing structure and it'll stay. And the nice thing is each year, if they don't have to disperse very far, they don't actually do so. So every year, it'll just increase and grow. And it's very easy to remove and replace these materials. If they do become saturated, you can simply introduce new raspberry stems or rose stems from your gardens. And so, yeah, the bees will move in, no problem.